Book 19, The Getaway.
There was a loud crack, and a jagged fork of purple and blue lightning flashed across the night sky. For a split second, the glen of gloom was lit up by a dazzling purplish light. It was nearly as bright as day. Then everything went black again. The moon and stars were surrounded by a thick mass of swirling thunderclouds. The sky above the glen was blacker than coal. Freezing gales of wind wailed and moaned as they blasted across the mountain peaks. The wind howled down into the glen and made the tangled forest of prickly bushes bend and sway and rattle. Sheets of soaking rain came drumming down to the ground. Crack! Another flash of forked lightning zigzagged across the sky. Crash, boom, pow! Croaker and Squealer were standing outside the cave. They were soaked through. What's more, Squealer was beginning to tremble like a leaf. Thunderstorms frightened him.
"Let's hide,"
he whispered to Croaker.
"We can't stay out here when it's so stormy. We may be struck by lightning."
Croaker looked all around the glen. The snagron was nowhere to be seen.
"All right," he said with a growl. "I don't suppose the snagron will come to see us while it's raining so hard. It won't do any harm to shelter for a minute or two. Our prisoners can't escape from this jail. There's no way out."
As he said these words, another terrific clap of thunder seemed to shake the ground under their feet. Kerpow! Squealer didn't wait any longer. Squeaking and squealing with fright, he dashed for the shelter of a nearby pile of rocks. Croaker dashed after him. Back inside the cave, Jock, Tosh, and Don were wide awake. They were in a miserable state. Little Don looked thin and drawn. He was as white as a sheet. He was freezing cold, and he couldn't stop his teeth from chattering. He felt awful. Tosh sat in a corner. His eyes were blurred and bloodshot. He was hot and thirsty, and his head was hurting. He was dazed and confused, and he kept forgetting where he was. He began to think that the loud crashes of thunder would drive him insane. The row was so bad that Tosh expected the roof to burst apart and come crashing down on them. Quivering with terror, he held his head in his hands. Jock did not feel quite so bad as the others. He did feel homesick, and he missed the chief of the clan and the rest of his friends. He looked across at Don and Tosh. He knew that if someone didn't take over as their leader soon, they would never escape. Jock didn't want to be the leader, but he could see that nobody else would do the job. He put his arms round the other two and prayed that the storm would go away. Slowly, very slowly, the thunder clouds drifted towards the distant hills. At last, the thunder was just a faint rumble coming from far, far away. Tosh and Don didn't stir. They simply sat there without moving. Jock was alarmed to see that they were hardly breathing. He knew that it was important to do something quickly. He stood up and shook them. Then he spoke quite firmly.
"Come on, you two,"
he said.
"I'm very sorry to disturb you, but it's no good just sitting looking at each other. If we're going to survive, we should try to think of some ways of getting out of this place. Don't forget that the Snagron and her two nasty friends are sure to come back and torment us in the morning. They hate us, and they'll make us pay with our blood. Those Todons are brutes. They can't wait to get their claws onto us. There's only one law in this glen, and that's the law of the jungle. The Todons would just love to murder us. If we stay here much longer, it will be too late. There'll be no hope for any of us. We've got to get out of this jail somehow, and the sooner we get started, the better."
The other two didn't say a word.
"Well,"
said Jock.
"I'm waiting for someone to say something."
Tosh groaned.
"It's hopeless,"
he said.
"How can we possibly escape when the Todons are watching us like hawks?"
Jock crawled towards the front of the cave. He looked out through the tangle of curling branches. The Todons were nowhere to be seen. He looked upwards and saw that the sky was still cloudy and that it was still raining. Jock worked out at once that the Todons must be sheltering from the rain. He turned to the others with a smile.
"It's all right,"
he told them.
"The Todons have gone. They must have found somewhere to shelter."
"Thank goodness for that,"
said Tosh. Now that he had something to think about, Tosh was feeling a lot better.
"Right then,"
he said.
"I agree with you, Jock. You've got my vote if you want to escape. But how are we going to do it? We're not moles, so we can't dig our way out."
Little Don still felt unhappy.
"It's no use,"
he blurted out.
"I'm afraid that looking for a way out will be more difficult than trying to find a needle in a haystack, and I'll tell you why. I've been right to the back of this rotten cave, and all I found was a creepy room heaped up with loads and loads of old bones and skeletons. It was just like a graveyard."
"We can't just give up,"
insisted Jock.
"Are you sure that you went as far back as you possibly could?"
Don frowned. "Well, there was another branch of the tunnel leading deeper underground," he admitted. "But I think it would be a big mistake to go down there. It was full of bloodthirsty bats. Anyway, it's much too dark to go down there now. It wouldn't be safe. We could get lost and have to roam around in the darkness for months. We'd need a bright light or a torch to see our way." Jock smiled.
"Well now,"
he said happily,
"maybe I can help you out. I've got all sorts of useful things loaded away in my pocket. It was lucky I took the time to look through my chest of drawers before we set off. Just wait for a moment or two, and we'll see what I've got. I hope I haven't forgotten anything."
Jock quickly unzipped his pocket and began to sort through all the things it contained. After a minute or two, he pulled out a thick wax candle and a box of matches. Without saying a word, he struck a match and lit the candle.
"That's super,"
gasped Tosh.
"Thank goodness one of us has used his brains. Come on then, let's have a look around."
Jock strode off into the darkness. With Jock leading the way, the three friends marched off towards the back of the cave. The pale yellow candlelight lit up horrible clumps of mushrooms and toadstools that sprouted up from the dirty yellow clay. They were far bigger than anything the three friends had ever seen before.
Now, remember to keep up with us,
said Tosh, turning to speak to little Don.
We must make it a rule that we stick together, so don't stray off or dawdle. If you do, you'll just get left further and further behind.
Don gulped. The last thing he intended to do was to go straying off. The flickering candle made the cave seem spookier than ever. The jagged piles of rock loomed out of the darkness like awful monsters with wide open jaws and sharp teeth, waiting to leap out at them and bite their throats. Don's insides were churning with fright. He wanted to scream. Tosh held his hand.
Don't be silly,
he whispered.
They're only piles of old stones.
But Don was still frightened.
They may only be rocks,
he said to himself.
But suppose something is lurking behind them.
He stayed close to Tosh. Crouching down, the three friends entered the first small tunnel. They had to brush their way past dusty cobwebs, which were hanging down like curtains from the roof and walls. The three explorers could hear lots of little scratching sounds, as if some sort of animal was prowling around at the far end of the tunnel. Now and again, they saw the glitter of gleaming eyes in the candlelight. By now, the walls of the tunnel were streaming with filthy green water. In some places, showers of this dirty green liquid came spraying down on their heads. They were having to tramp through thick, squishy mud and green slime. Before long, they were soaked to the skin. The water running down the ground was now deep enough to form a small stream. They had to paddle and wade their way along. It was very difficult, and they kept slipping backwards and splashing into the water. Jock had a hard job to keep the candle alight. At long last, the tunnel began to dry out. It was much easier now, though sometimes the roof came so low that Tosh and Jock had to crawl on their hands and feet. But it did not take too long to reach the end of the tunnel. Very slowly, Jock held up the candle and looked into the rocky room. Drawing back a step, he froze in horror. He very nearly dropped the candle. The room was crawling with thousands of spine-chilling animals. There were big fat cockroaches and beetles, bloated spiders and maggots, toads, snakes and lizards. They were creeping and crawling all over the heaps of old bones. They were eating the bits of raw flesh, skin and fur that the snagron had left behind. As soon as they saw the candlelight, the quicker animals slid off into the darkness, squeezing into cracks and holes in the rock. The maggots, slugs and snails were left to get on with their grisly feast. Jock squirmed and held his nose.
Yuck!
He said,
What a foul stink! It makes me want to choke. I've never seen so much filth and dirtiness. The snagron must have murdered thousands of animals and dragged them down here to eat. Look at all those bloodstains.
Tosh looked down at the skeletons.
Some of them were still fixed to rusty chains. The snagron must have kept them chained to the wall until she was ready to eat them. The three friends moved into the middle of the room. Don looked up at the roof, which was far, far above them.
"There's a small hole up there,"
he said.
"but you can't see it now because the sky is still too cloudy."
"It will be difficult to get up there,"
said Tosh, straining his eyes to see.
"But I think it can be done. I'll have a go if you like,"
he added, pretending that he was not at all frightened.
No,
said Jock. "Let's wait a bit. We'll have a look down the other tunnel first." They moved across to the other side of the room and stopped when they reached the dark archway which marked the beginning of the second tunnel. Don's legs began to tremble.
"Well, here goes,"
he said.
"Look out for the bats."
But there were no bats to be seen. The long, dark tunnel stretched out before them. They moved along slowly, not quite sure what to expect next. There were lots of little chip marks on the walls, as if the tunnel had been carved out of the solid rock. At first, there were no corners or turnings. The tunnel sloped steeply downwards. It was like an underground roadway, boring deeper and deeper into the mountain. The fuzzbuzzes were able to move much more quickly now. They kept going for some time. Then suddenly the tunnel began to twist and turn. The tunnel wound on and on. The three friends were wondering if it would ever end. It seemed to be leading nowhere. They began to feel quite tired, so they stopped for a short rest.
"I'm just about worn out,"
said Don with a sleepy yawn.
"I'd love a long, cool drink,"
said Tosh, licking his lips thirstily.
Shh!
Snapped Jock.
Can you hear something?
A faint splashing sound came from round the next corner.
Come on,
shouted Jock.
let's see what it is.
They struggled to their feet and moved forwards. There was nothing round the next corner, but the splashing sounds were getting louder. They turned the next corner. Still nothing, but the sound was much louder. They turned the next corner and stopped in amazement. They had entered another big cave, but to their dismay, they could see that this was the end of the road. This cave was flooded with deep, green, murky water. At the far end of the cave was a foaming waterfall. Smaller waterfalls fell in cascades down the sides of the cave. They gleamed and sparkled in the candlelight. They were lots of different colours and shades. The waterfalls were filling up the still green lake. Jock held up the candle so everyone could see.
What a shame,
he whispered.
We'd need a boat to get out this way. Unless anyone wants to dive in and swim across. Who wants to try?
They all looked down at the lake. Nobody wanted to swim. It would be too easy to drown. Jock took a closer look at the murky water. Thick strands of brown and orange weed were floating on the top. Here and there he could see wobbly mounds of slime or jelly. It looked a bit like frog spawn, but each mound was far too big. Now and again, the lake swirled and foamed as if something was stirring up the water. Jock stepped back. He felt sure that something was watching them. He heard lots of little plops and splashes.
coming out of the darkness. He couldn't be sure, but he thought that he could hear growls, croaks, and snarls coming from different parts of the lake. At any second, he expected something horrible to slither out of the water and attack them. He was just about ready to run when Don began to shout.
Look, over there. Can you see something?
They strained their eyes and squinted into the darkness. They could just make out the shape of something as it floated out of the gloom. At first, they couldn't see it properly, but as it began to float closer, it suddenly dawned on Jock what the thing was.
It's a nest,
he blurted out.
Good Lord! Just look at the size of it.
The biggest nest they had ever seen in their lives was slowly sailing towards them. It was made from sticks and branches, bits of rotten driftwood, and lots of straw and hay. It was held together by a brownish coating of sticky mud. Inside, it was lined with animal fur, and right in the middle there lay 2 big white eggs.
This must be the snagron's nest,
shouted Jock.
The snagron must have laid those eggs.
The fuzzbuzzes went quiet. They were thinking about what would happen if the eggs hatched out. The clan would never be able to fight against 2 more snagrons.
What shall we do?
asked Tosh.
There's only one answer to that question,
said Jock.
Those eggs must be smashed.
The nest was still too far away to reach, so Jock crouched down and picked up a smooth, round pebble. Slowly he took aim. Then, as powerfully as possible, he hurled the pebble across the water. Splash! It just missed. As Jock stooped to pick up some more pebbles, a blood-curdling screech came from above their heads. For the first time, the fuzzbuzzes looked up at the roof. What they saw made their spines tingle and their legs quiver and quake. The roof was crawling with an army of black bats. They had heard the sound of the pebble hitting the water, and it had disturbed them. Now they were stirred up and angry. One by one they dropped off the roof and swooped down on the frightened fuzzbuzzes. In next to no time they were surrounded by crowds of darting, swooping bats. All they could see was the blur of beating wings. The cave was filled with the sound of angry squeaks, squeals and squawks as the bats attacked. While Jock watched in horror, one of the bats came swooping down like a hawk, aiming itself at his outstretched arm.
Watch out!
shouted Tosh, but it was too late. Jock squawked as he felt a sharp pain on the back of his hand. A needle-sharp claw grabbed the candle.
Ow!
Jock howled, and the candle dropped to the ground. This was the last straw.
Run!
bawled Jock.
Quick! Run for your lives!
But the candle had gone out, and now the cave was as black as a coal mine. Don was frightened out of his wits. With a loud howl, he turned tail and ran. The others hurtled after him. They crowded into the tunnel, hardly knowing what they were doing. They nearly trampled on each other in their hurry to get out. They went pounding down the tunnel, shouting and screaming in terror. They ran and they ran until the sound of the bats was far behind them. Somehow, they all made it back to the room full of skeletons. Puffing and panting, they sprawled out on the ground next to the heap of old bones. They were too worn out to be frightened anymore. At long last, the three friends were able to sit up.
That was a close shave,
Panted Jock.
Those bats gave me the fright of my life.
He looked down at his hand. It was bleeding badly and felt very painful. He could still see the bat's teeth marks. He unzipped his pocket and rooted around until he found a small first aid box. Quickly he chose a sticking plaster and stuck it over the cut.
I think they must have been vampire bats,
He joked.
They seem to be after my blood.
He looked up at the roof. The storm clouds had drifted away and a faint ray of moonlight was coming in through the hole.
Get up, you two,
He said firmly.
We can't afford to roam around this cave forever. If we're going to find a way out of here, we'd better get a move on.
He looked back at the roof with a frown.
That's the only way out we've seen so far,
He told them.
I suppose we'd better try to get up there. If only we could all fly like birds, it would be simple.
No sooner had he spoken these words than Don started to cry. He was dismayed at the thought of having to climb out through the hole in the roof.
Don't include me, he wailed. I'm far too weak to get up there. I'll fall and hurt myself. I want to stay here.
Jock scowled at him.
Stop that bawling, you little coward.
He groaned.
There's no excuse for crying like a little boy. Firstly, we're not leaving you here all by yourself. Secondly, that hole seems to be the only exit from this cave. And thirdly, if we stay here, we will not be allowed to live. The Snagron intends to kill us all. So you can just stop crying and squawking and feeling sorry for yourself. I mean what I say, and I don't want to hear any more moans and groans.
Tosh agreed with Jock.
You're acting like a bird brain, Don,
Said Tosh.
I'm sure you don't want to be a jailbird for the rest of your life. Just think of all the things you'll miss. You'll never have another birthday party. You'll never see the summer sun. You'll never hear the blackbirds singing in the fir trees. You'll never see any of your friends again. I know that you can be as stubborn as a mule, but you're not staying here for the rest of your life, so you can just stop complaining. You're coming with us, even if we've got to hit you on the jaw and carry you, and that's an order.
Don tried to stop crying. He bowed his head in shame. He didn't like being accused of being a coward, but he knew he deserved it.
I'm sorry,
He said.
I don't blame you for getting cross with me. I know I'm useless and I'm not very brave, but I will try harder.
Good,
Said Jock.
now just wait for a second or two. I've got one or two more things hidden away in my pocket. Just give me a bit of time to sort them out.
First of all, he pulled out the box of matches. He handed them to Tosh.
Strike a match, please.
He said.
Then I can see what I'm doing.
Tosh lit a match and held it up. Jock worked quickly. First of all, he pulled out a short steel hammer. Then he pulled out a tin full of nails.
Hurry up,
Said Tosh.
this match is burning my fingers.
Nearly finished.
Said Jock, and he pulled out a ball of long, thin rope. Don and Tosh were astounded. How did Jock make so many things fit into such a small pocket?
Ouch!
shouted Tosh. The match had burned his fingers. He lit another one as Jock started to speak.
Stop gawping at me,
He snapped.
We've got to start working. We've no time to build a ladder, so we'll have to climb up. You'd better go first, Tosh, because you're as nimble as a mountain goat, and your boots will get a good grip on this slippery rock. Don can go second, and I'll go third.
Tosh nodded.
All right, he said. And when the rock gets too smooth, I'll hammer some nails in. They'll form a sort of ladder. And when I get to the top, I'll lower the rope and you can attach Don to it. Then I'll simply pull him up.
Don gulped, but he didn't say anything. Tosh took the rope and wound it round and round his waist. He held the big steel nails in his mouth. Then, carrying the hammer in his left hand, he started to scramble upwards. At first it was easy, but in many places the upper part of the wall was smooth and greasy, and it was hard to get a firm grip. Tosh was praying that he would not tumble and fall. He began to feel hot and sticky. He took off his woolen scarf and dropped it to the ground. He kept stopping to wipe the wetness from his brow. Just one slip and all their plans would fail. He crawled upwards as slowly as a snail. Every so often, he stopped to hammer in a nail. Sometimes the hammer would smash against the hard rock and a shower of bright blue sparks would light up the cave. But for the rest of the time, it was awfully dark. After a long while, he felt a cool, fresh wind coming from the hole in the roof. He looked up and saw the twinkle of 1,000 stars. But now he had reached the hardest bit. The crack in the roof was not as wide as it looked. Very slowly, Tosh squeezed his way upwards. He thought he had made it, when suddenly it happened. He got stuck. The thick bundle of rope around his waist had made him too fat. It had caught against the rock, and it would not allow him to move. The strain was too much for Tosh. He began to panic.
Curses!
He shouted.
I can't move!
He struggled and strained to pull himself free. Luckily, Jock could see what had happened and called out to him.
Try breathing in, Tosh. That may make you thinner.
Tosh breathed in, and with one last big effort, he came bursting out of the hole. He was free at last.
Hooray!
Shouted Jock.
Well done!
But there was no time to stop for a rest. As quickly as possible, he unwound the rope and dropped one end back down into the cave. Jock jumped up and caught it. Just as quickly, he fixed it round Don's waist. Then, pulling with all his power, Tosh began to draw Don slowly upwards. The rope kept twirling round and round, and little Don soon started to feel dizzy. Moaning and groaning, he closed his eyes and prayed that he would not fall.
Now I know what a bird feels like,
he muttered to himself as the rope swayed backwards and forwards like a seesaw. He wondered what would happen if the rope frayed and snapped in two. He'd crash down to the ground and end up just like strawberry jam. The long trip upwards seemed to take more than 30 years, but when he reached the top, Don was surprised to see that he was quite unhurt. Now it was Tosh's turn to complain. He was tired out.
You were a heavy load,
he panted.
It was no joke trying to pull you up. You may only look little, but you must weigh more than a sack of coal. It's a wonder the rope didn't snap.
Don put his tongue out.
Don't be rude,
he said.
You shouldn't accuse me of being fat. Just be grateful I'm not as heavy as Windbag.
Now Jock started to climb upwards. Shortly, he too came squeezing out of the hole. They had done it. They had found freedom at long last. The three friends began to feel quite chirpy. They knew they were lucky to be alive, and they felt happier than they had felt for months. They looked up at the starry sky. It was a fine, dry night, and all the clouds had vanished. They were standing on top of a towering cliff, and deep down in the glen they could see the green pool gleaming in the moonlight. It was incredible, but by a stroke of good fortune they had come out on the outskirts of the Glen of Gloom. Now they could travel home without entering the glen at all. The Glen MacFuzz was several miles away, but that didn't matter. Don yawned. He looked down at his torn and tattered nightgown. He saw all the dirt on his hands and feet. He began to daydream. He thought of having a good soak in a steaming hot bath full of soapy water. He thought of standing in front of a roasting fire with a dry towel to rub himself down. He thought of supper with hot toast and melting butter. He thought of Windbag standing in his doorway with his bagpipes in his hand. He hoped Windbag would play a tune to welcome them home. He looked forward to getting into his lovely soft bed with clean sheets and a hot water bottle. He would be able to curl up into a ball and go to sleep. He could hardly wait to get back.
Oh, come on.
He said, yawning sleepily.
Let's go home.
Yes,
Said Jock with a smile.
let's do that.
Without another sound, the three partners set off on the long march home. If they went at top speed, they would arrive in the Glen MacFuzz before dawn. Read these questions and then write your answer neatly. Do not forget where to put capital letters and full stops. 1. Why did Squealer want to hide? 2. Why did Jock think that they needed a leader? 3. Which Fuzzbuzz thought that it was impossible to escape? 4. How did Jock make sure that they could see in the darkness? 5. Draw some of the animals that were crawling around the rocky room. 6. What was at the end of the second tunnel? 7. What was the nest made of? 8. Why did Jock drop the candle? 9. What else did Jock pull out of his pocket? 10. Who was the first to climb out of the cave? 11. Draw the bit of the story that you liked best.